suppose.
Yes. It will be a very strange atmosphere around the Cabinet table. As I say, I think the key figure today, I keep saying this, is Sir Graham Brady, who's got to put together a plan that everyone can get behind.
Chairman of the 1922
Absolutely.
Backbenchers.
And even to the extent...
A timetable.
Yeah, and even to the extent of how many MPs each would-be candidate needs in order to get into the first round.
Ordinarily, it's around 10, but they're saying it could be a higher threshold this time.
Yes.
And you think that'll be Monday?
Well, we're assuming that the elections for the committee will go on Monday, and then I assume on a very quick timetable it could be as early as Tuesday.
Some of our GB News viewers, Diana, are saying, what hypocrisy. A lot of Tory MPs, they criticised Boris Johnson for wanting to change the rules to help Owen Paterson, but now those same Tory backbenchers are changing the rules. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a critique that I've certainly had come through my inbox. I think it comes to a point, though, doesn't it, where there's clearly a complete lack of confidence in the Prime Minister, which, frankly, is a constitutional issue. Yep. And it becomes a point where I think the means do justify the ends.
Been great spending time with you, gentlemen. Patrick O'Flynn, political commentator, and indeed Mark Longhurst. I think we're going to be spending a lot of time together in the next few weeks and months. And once again, welcome from me and the newsroom, from all of us, and indeed many of our viewers and listeners, to GB
It's
News.
nice to be here, thank you.
You've been watching the briefing with me, Liam Halligan, and Hannah Davison. Next up, it's Rhiannon Jones once more with the GB News headlines.
Good afternoon. It's just gone 3 o'clock. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has announced his resignation as leader of the Conservative Party. Addressing the country outside Number 10, Mr Johnson said it's clearly the will of his party. He said he's deeply saddened to be giving up the best job in the world and that he fought to remain because he felt it was his job, his duty and his obligation. The decision to step down follows 3 days of government revolt that's seen almost 60 MPs, including 5 cabinet ministers, quit. Boris Johnson says he'll continue to serve as Prime Minister until the party chooses his successor, which is expected to happen by October.
I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Well, Boris Johnson's leadership has come under increased scrutiny in recent months following a number of scandals. He tried to protect former MP Owen Paterson, who repeatedly broke lobbying rules by attempting to overhaul the MP standards system. He also faced cross-party criticism for attending gatherings in Whitehall during lockdown, for which he was fined in April. And most recently, he was found to have promoted MP Chris Pincher to the Tory Whip's office, despite being aware of previous allegations of sexual misconduct. Meanwhile, Downing Street's announced the cabinet reshuffle to replace those who've either resigned or been sacked. Kit Malthouse has been appointed Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster, the most senior position after the Prime Minister's. James Cleverly's the new Education Secretary, Robert Buckland the new Welsh Secretary, Shailesh Vara the new Northern Ireland Secretary, and Greg Clark has replaced Michael Gove as Levelling Up Secretary, saying he'll do his best to provide stability in government. Whilst the former Technologies Minister, Chris Philp, has said he'd return to government if required, now that Boris Johnson has agreed to resign. Well, during his resignation speech earlier, Boris Johnson referred to the UK's support for Ukraine as one of the key achievements of his premiership and vowed to support their fight for freedom for as long as it takes. That as G20 foreign ministers are in Bali in Indonesia this week for a meeting that will focus on the war in Ukraine. It'll be the first time foreign ministers meet Russia's Sergei Lavrov since the start of the invasion back in February. His attendance is expected to cause a rift in the group, which includes Western countries that have accused Moscow of war crimes and imposed sanctions. In other news, British Airways staff at Heathrow Airport have suspended their planned strike action after the company made an improved pay offer. Workers had voted to take industrial action, saying a 10% wage cut during the height of the pandemic hadn't been reversed. But union leaders and airline chiefs held extensive negotiations today and an agreement has been reached. The Unite Union says it will now ballot its members, including check-in staff, on the proposed offer. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's over to Colin Brazier.
Well, hi there. Let's recap that news. If you are, well, where would you have been not to know this morning, this afternoon? The Prime Minister has resigned after a succession of apparent scandals and over 50 resignations in his government over the last 2 days. Boris Johnson has stepped aside. Here's what he had to say at an address outside Downing Street just after midday.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom.
Well, let's turn to our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who is in Downing Street for us this afternoon. Hi to you, Darren. Let's just start from scratch for people maybe just tuning in, listening on the radio. Let's reflect on what the Prime Minister had to say a couple of hours ago. Some people have called those words, some of which we just heard, we'll play it again in full around about 1:30, grudging. Others will see it as a typically sort of valedictory address. Why wouldn't he say, look at what I've achieved?
Yeah, in many regards, that's right. The Prime Minister wanted, because of course this is a moment of history, he wanted to make that mark that he felt he was being chucked out of office way too early, that he was, as he put it, quite upset, frankly, about not being able to carry out all the changes that he wanted to, and that he repeated time and time again that he had a large, what he would argue, personal mandate from the British public not that long ago to change Britain. And he was, in what he called an eccentric decision, by the Parliamentary Party as part of this kind of herd pact, being chucked out of office. He talked about the polling figures not being that bad and about the achievements that he had managed to get through over the last 2.5, 3 years, whether that's getting Brexit done, managing the pandemic and the vaccine rollout, its support for Ukraine. But you're right, there are critics, and critics even within his own party, who felt that it was tone deaf, there was no sense and recognition of the mistakes the Prime Minister had made, or indeed that he clung on to power, I should say, a little too long. So, you know, it's up to viewers at home, I think, to decide on balance where they felt it went. But in the end, you got this sense that he was slightly bitter about it all, and that fundamentally he was blaming his party for what he seems to think is a very, very strange decision that he is out. But he is out as Conservative leader, but not as Prime Minister. And that is important to remember, because he is currently inside number 10 Colin, chairing a cabinet meeting. We've just seen all the cabinet ministers, including those recently appointed, go in the last couple of minutes. Of course, some of them were merely 24 hours ago calling for him to resign, saying that they could not work under him. But for those ministers, they now argue that the government needs to function, and that is why they are part of the cabinet, part of this kind of caretaker government, if you like, Colin, to try and get through the next couple of months. And all this, of course, while attention, and as always the case, attention and power drains from this place, Boris Johnson, now effectively a lame duck leader, now moves to the Conservative Party and to those runners and riders, those leadership hopefuls who will start their campaigns in earnest to try and win that contest and become the next incumbent of 10 Downing Street.
Darren, for now, thanks very much indeed. Darren McCaffrey there. Let's turn to Lloyd Russell Moyle, Labour MP for Brighton and Kent Town. Lloyd Russell Moyle, welcome to you. It's always a strange time when you get an internal psychodrama like this in the government. Strange time for the opposition. There's a temptation, understandable temptation, just to sit back and enjoy the spectacle. There are some who feel, though, that Sir Keir Starmer ought to be really bullish about this and say, look, let's do away with this idea of an interim Prime Minister. Let's have a vote of no confidence.
Well, that's what he has indicated he would do if the Conservatives can't get rid of Boris Johnson quickly, because we've now had revelations, including at the liaison committee yesterday, that Boris Johnson has been secretly meeting KGB and former KGB agents without telling the authorities properly, without having them recording the meetings, and even at one meeting there a direct line to Putin's foreign minister. These are disgraceful allegations of a disgraced Prime Minister that really needs to be going very quickly. So we have said that if the Tory party can't dispatch of this criminal Prime Minister, we will do it by a vote of no confidence. He must go now. He's dangerous to national security.
We sat through the liaison committee yesterday. We heard the points that were made by Chris Bryant there. The Prime Minister had an opportunity to address some of those questions, but they are allegations at this stage. Certainly some of the allegations you make are very serious about
the Prime Minister acknowledged that he had met the agent and the person who's now sanctioned.
He acknowledged that he had a meeting in Italy with a former independent editor of
he might have afterwards.
Yeah. A story maybe for another day. Let's just park that now if we can. I mean, we're looking at so many different strands today. From the opposition's point of view, it's become almost an article of faith that Keir Starmer and his closest acolytes are pretty happy. They were pretty happy with the settlement as was. They saw Boris Johnson as an electoral liability for the Conservatives, rightly or wrongly. And now you're looking potentially at someone, I'm looking, for instance, at the latest polls for someone like Rishi Sunak. OK, one poll doesn't tell us a trend, but actually when you put Sunak up against Starmer, Rishi Sunak wins.
Well, this is the problem. You are quite right. And Boris Johnson staying was the very best thing for the Labour Party and Keir Starmer, my leader. But we do what's best for the country. What's best for the country is to try and get him out as quick as possible. And even if that means that it will be a tougher election when it comes, that is the price that we pay to protect the country. Now, I think the Tory party has a number of probably very honourable members that might stand. I've been on record before saying Penny Mordaunt would be an extremely difficult challenger for us if she were to run as the Prime Minister against us. But equally, there are some real rogues that are trying to stand who have propped up Boris Johnson for a long time, including people like Liz Truss, So we will see who the Tory party select. They don't always have a history of getting the person that we all expect, do they? We often get the surprise victor in the Conservative Party, and that might mean that people look and say, we want to give Labour and Keir Starmer a go, someone we know and compared to the Conservatives can trust.
Lloyd, Russell, Moyle, appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thanks very much indeed. Let's get a Conservative perspective then from the Conservative MP for North East Bedfordshire. That's Richard Fuller, also in Westminster. Where else today? Richard Fuller, welcome to you. Where to begin? The dust has settled a little bit on events over the last 24 hours.
Yes.
Give us your first impressions, your thoughts today. How does this go down in political history?
Well, I don't know about that, but yesterday evening, as all this was progressing, the resignations were coming out, I had 20 of my constituents, just members of the public, visiting Parliament, have a tour around Parliament. And as we were talking, I asked them, so who thinks the Prime Minister should go, who thinks he should stay? And it was 50-50, and we had a discussion about it. And it was interesting that there was still very strong support for the Prime Minister. That tells me that a lot of people who supported the Prime Minister, supported Brexit, supported the Prime Minister to get it done, you know, they'll have questions today, now that the Prime Minister's gone, about what happens next. And for those who say, you know, Brexit's done, we don't need to worry about it, shouldn't worry, I still think that establishing our strategy, now we have left the European Union, our national strategy is still a work in progress, and we have to make sure that we deliver that for those who gave us the democratic mandate to do so.
So John Major, former Prime Minister Sir John Major, has written to the chair of the 1922 committee and said Boris Johnson cannot remain as an interim Prime Minister. There needs to be a caretaker Prime Minister until the country gets a new Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. What would you say to Sir John Major?
Well, I think Sir John Major didn't want Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister at all anyway, so I don't think his suggestion now carries particular additional weight. He does, of course. Sir John Major was a very respected Prime Minister, actually a very successful, in economic terms, Prime Minister. But I think perhaps a lot of the conversation today is sort of filling the air about an issue about an existing Prime Minister. We know that when Mr Cameron stood down, we know that when Mrs May stood down, they stayed on as Prime Minister. I think that's the process we should continue now.
Richard Fuller, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for it. Let's just turn to my studio guest for the next hour or so, Joanne Adler, Conservative commentator. Joanne, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
If you can't come in today, then when can you come in, for heaven's sake? I'm just trying to get a sense of where the matter now rests. It won't rest here for very long, will it? Things are moving even now, but it just feels like after so much frenetic, unknowable activity for 24 hours, it's just a pause.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the Prime Minister's moves today have slightly taken the heat out of this situation. But, you know, as your guests have alluded to, there's still a very big question mark about whether he can remain in place as the caretaker. And I think that that will partly be resolved by the behaviour of the Cabinet, the new Cabinet that he's managed to put together earlier before his statement in number 10. And I think it's actually, he's brought in some very, very capable people. And if the Cabinet now pulls together, and if there are no further resignations over this issue of him potentially remaining as the caretaker, then I would imagine that we're likely to see him remain as the caretaker.
Okay. In whose gift ultimately is it? Is it really where the power resides, the brute politics and calculus of who says what in Cabinet? Or is it with the chair of the 1922 committee who can decide on the timescale of the leadership election?
Well, I think as we've seen, the sort of power structure within the Conservative Party is sort of fairly organic, and there's been a very...
The best euphemism of the day so far.
Well, I think there's been a movement over the last few days, particularly to try and rewrite certain rules, and that would have been done to have forced a decision from the Prime Minister. We've had a decision from the Prime Minister. It may not be the decision that everybody wants, but I don't feel that there is an absolute consensus one way or the other at the moment. So, as I say, I think the question is, can he hold a government together for the next week, let alone the next 2 or 3 months.
And how can you stop people grandstanding? I mean, if you've got someone, if Zahawi's Chancellor, how do you stop Zahawi basically using the next 2 months or the next few weeks as a pitch for the top job by, say, cutting taxes? I know the Prime Minister would have to sign it off, but he would still have some latitude, wouldn't he, at the Treasury?
Well, I mean, in a sense, that's as much a problem for Mr. Zahawi as it is for the Prime Minister, because he would if he's serious about running for leadership, he would need to be seen to be doing the right thing. Yeah. And therefore, in a sense, that ability to grandstand may work to everybody's advantage if people are showing their best side ahead of an election.
You raised a very important point, Joanne, which is none of these people, very few of these people, have publicly declared they're even going to stand. And certainly Nadhim Zahawi hasn't. I'm sure he probably will. Let's get some emails. Paul says, Conservatives have lost half of the country this morning getting rid of Boris. I'm happy now. Conservatives are finished. Elaine says, I'm appalled by the way that Boris has been hounded from office. The mainstream media has ousted a politician who won a huge majority and achieved a great deal. Agreed he wasn't perfect, but he was charismatic and a proven vote winner. I have now lost faith in our democracy. What a travesty. Barry says, big mistake shunting him out. Still think he was the best man for the job, and no one's ever going to be any better. We may well all live to regret this. He's the best we've had, and the next will not better him. Angie says Labour have achieved their aim and got rid of Boris, but they still can't stop sticking the knife in by now demanding an apology. I suppose that's what the opposition is meant to do, isn't it? But Boris has nothing to apologise for. It is Labour who should be apologising for their witch hunt and going against the democracy of our country, which voted Boris into office. The Prime Minister's resignation comes 2 years, 349 days into his premiership. Where does that compare? How does it compare with previous holders of this office? The longest-serving PM, Sir Robert Walpole, 20 years and 314 days. A job made more survivable by the absence then of rolling news media and Twitter. More recent PMs, the likes of Tony Blair. Tony Blair ranked 9th, 10 years and 56 days. The subject of Boris Johnson's biography about Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill ranked 12th, 8 years and 239 days, of course, over 2 separate terms. David Cameron, just to bring this up to speed to more modern times, at 22nd, and Theresa May at 33rd. Let's turn to the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Henry, welcome to you. You've got a few weeks to look forward to where you'll be extremely busy and much read.
Well, nothing's better for business than for Conservative Home than a leadership contest. In that sense, we're really a slightly counter-cyclical industry from the Conservative point of view. The chaos makes for excellent copy.
Can I just start with the Boris Johnson speech? We're going to run it again for our viewers and listeners in about 10 minutes, and they can arrive at their own judgments and determinations, can't they? It wasn't long. There was a lot in it. Was it grudging? Was it embittered? Was it a cri de coeur? Was it written by him? Was it written on the hoof? Give us a sense of it.
I suspect it was almost certainly written by members of his team. That's the way these things usually go. It's interesting that he didn't actually use the word resignation once. I think if you tuned in to that speech and you didn't immediately know what it was about, you probably wouldn't have been immediately able to tell that it was a resignation speech. There was certainly no contrition there. He clearly feels, as his conduct has demonstrated, that he's in the right, that he is the right man for the job, that he is being forced. He's basically saying, I'm being forced out by other members of parliament, and I think that is a strange decision, but the alliance of forces against him is such that he has to accept it.
Henry, I'm looking at if Conservative Home is the online Bible of the Conservative Party, then the Telegraph, I suppose, is the newspaper variant. Alistair Heath, the top of the front page today, he's got a headline attached to his name. He says, it's ending in disaster, but the Prime Minister saved Britain from Corbyn and Remainers. As a proportion of the Tory party, how many people feel that way, do you think?
Well, it's difficult to say in terms of hard numbers, but there is certainly a core of Conservative activists who are committed to Boris Johnson, who believe in Boris Johnson. Maybe he's the man who brought them into Conservative politics in the first place. And of course, in any Tory leadership contest, the final stage is between two people in a national ballot of Conservative Party members. And I think you can see from the manoeuvring of some of the candidates today and over the last few days that they're bearing that in mind. People like Liz Truss, Nadhim Zahawi, who decided not to resign, are thinking Boris is probably going to go anyway. But if I haven't been seen to stick the knife in and I'm seen to have stuck with him in cabinet, I'm more likely to win the support of that very energetic minority, admittedly, but that very energetic minority of registered Conservatives who are committed supporters of the Prime Minister.
Henry, would any of the contenders want to be anointed by this Prime Minister?
Almost certainly not. I mean, there is nobody who could do it, and he doesn't have the authority to anoint somebody, really, in terms of it wouldn't do anything to shut the contest down. But I think it's a more subtle game than that, because nobody wants to be the designated heir apparent to a man who has just had 50 plus members of his government resign and been forced out of office. It would be a complete poison chalice. I think that the manoeuvre that these people have to try and pull off, and it will be quite a tricky one, is to put enough distance between themselves and the Prime Minister to reassure them. Remember, the majority of their parliamentary colleagues, the great majority of their parliamentary colleagues who have ousted him, and a substantial number of Conservative activists who feel the same way, whilst not being so vocal that they alienate the Prime Minister's supporters. It's a very tricky balancing act to pull off, and it will be interesting to see who does it best.
Can we just go back to to earlier this morning, before the announcement dribbled out around about 9 o'clock? Julian Smith, former cabinet minister, talked about the Prime Minister hanging on in the same way. He likened it to the situation in Washington with Donald Trump. Do you think there were people within Conservative circles who were really starting to grow uncomfortable, with those parallels?
I think there is a really unfortunate tendency for British politicos to reach for American comparisons where they're very seldom fitting. And I don't think it really fit here. You can see why some of them did. I think that one of the worst things about this for Conservative supporters, and indeed for anyone concerned about the good health of the Constitution, was some of the really deranged stuff that was coming out of the Prime Minister's closest supporters. Nadine Dorries saying that they were going to do mass deselections of every Conservative MP that voted against him, which would have been most of them, and then call a general election. That would have been a horrifying prospect, and it would have risked dragging the Queen into politics and all the rest of it. But in terms of, no, I think actually what this has proven is the strength of our parliamentary system, because whilst there was some of that wild talk, we've had nothing like January the 6th. The Prime Minister has, after one night's sleep, decided that discretion is the better part of valour. He's doing the proper thing, albeit more slowly than people would like, and he's stepping down.
Yeah, I think he put it rather well when he talked about the brilliance of the Darwinian system. It is Darwinian, isn't it? It's a rough trade, but it often arrives at an answer that needs to be reached. I'm just looking at that list of... I'm looking at the latest poll, Henry, and I'm looking at the list of potential candidates for the office of Prime Minister. And I don't see anybody on that list who you could describe as a red wall candidate. Will there be one?
It's early days. It's very hard to say. It's a very open contest. There's no heir apparent. There's nobody really casting a shadow over this race. When Conservative Home polled a series of head-to-head clashes between potential contenders the other day, there were a huge amount of don't knows. So I don't want to rule out somebody basically doing a David Cameron, what he did in 2005, which is, give a very good speech, have a better organisation than many people expect, and kind of just overtake some people and make an impression early on. But no, I think part of the problem for the Conservatives at the moment is that they don't yet, those Red Wall MPs, they've only been there for 3 years. The 2019 election wasn't that long ago. They haven't had enough time to really get into cabinet and to build up the profile. So it will be challenging. And one of the things the Conservative Party now needs to be really careful about is that they're picking from a pool of leadership contenders who are basically from their pre-2019 electoral coalition. And if they want to have a long-term future as a party, they really want to try and lock down the gains that Boris Johnson achieved, to his great credit, in the Red Wall. So it will be not somebody from the Red Wall, but it will be interesting. It's a bit like the European Union or the Constitution of Northern Ireland. Who can tailor their message to those voters best is going to be one of the key tests I think Tory MPs will be putting leadership candidates through over the next few weeks.
Henry Hill is the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. Henry Hill, really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Fabulous analysis. Let's go back to Westminster. Our political correspondent Tom Harwood is there, having had a very busy 24 hours and more. Tom, welcome to you. The action today, in a sense, and it has been at Downing Street for a while, and we're still seeing cabinet appointments being made there, or at least ministerial appointments, I should say, being made there, and that's where the focus of media attention is. But in the corridors behind you, give us a sense of what the big conversations that are happening there now are.
Do you know what? It's such a funny atmosphere in Parliament. I've just come from the terrace where there are a number of MPs sitting in almost a state of sort of suspended animation, sort of not quite absorbing the magnitude of what has happened in what is relatively a short space of time. The Prime Minister seemed fairly safe at the start of the week until that cabinet resignation from Sajid Javid set the wheels of change in motion, and really we've had the most remarkable few days. I think to some extent members of Parliament, many of whom will be heading home this evening back to their constituencies, will need to have a bit of a sit down, a bit of a breather, a bit of a recognition of the magnitude of the events that have taken place over the last few hours. And a lot of people now speculating, looking to the future. As you were saying in your previous conversation, Colin, the conversation has turned to what takes place next week and indeed the week after as these parliamentary rounds of the leadership contest take place. Who on earth is going to succeed Boris Johnson? It's not by any means a done deal. Compare this to the previous leadership contest where it was most people had a fairly good idea of who was the front runner, of where the direction of play was moving. This time around, no one is feeling like they can make any fairly solid predictions. And so the sense here in Westminster is one of potentially sitting back, taking in what has gone on, but also uncertainty as to what's to come.
Tom Harwood at Westminster. Tom, thanks very much indeed. Let's go back to Joanne Adler, Conservative commentator, who's alongside me here in the studio. Joanne, will the next Conservative leader be offering a manifesto which is ideological? Because we never really got a sense of Johnsonianism, or did we?
Well, not really, because I think Boris Johnson was partly selected because he appeared at any one particular moment to be able to articulate a message to different parts of the Conservative coalition. And of course, he had one very specific thing that he had to do, which was to get Brexit done, or rather to get Brexit through, because it hasn't been fully done. I mean, I think to answer your question, the real dilemma for the Conservative MPs in the first instance is how they address this problem. You alluded earlier to the red wall issue, but there is also the so-called now blue wall, the threat coming in from the Liberal Democrats in the South. And I think that is why there's quite a high possibility that whoever emerges as the next leader will be someone who is able to articulate something that appeals to both of those constituencies, and therefore they won't be ideological as such. They won't have a sort of definable ideology, which I think is a bit of a shame, because I would like to see somebody with a clearer set of Conservative principles.
And when a party's been in power for as long as the Conservatives have been, doesn't it really need somebody to say, I'm not like the last guy or the last woman or the guy before her, this is something new?
Well, up to a point, because the Conservative Party won an election in 2019 based on a manifesto, and that's what they owe the British public to deliver. And I think to start changing that manifesto too dramatically now would actually be something of a, they don't have the mandate to do that.
It's a really good point, Joanne, for now. Thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we'll be heading to one potential leadership hopeful. Nobody's really declared officially so far, have they? Penny Mordaunt, her constituency, Portsmouth North, to see what the mood is there. First, we've got a news update for you.
Thank you, Colin. It's 3:32. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has said it was clearly the will of his party that there should be a new leader. He announced his resignation outside Number 10 following 3 days of government revolt that's seen almost 60 MPs, including 5 cabinet ministers, quit. Boris Johnson says he'll continue to serve as Prime Minister until the party chooses his successor, which is expected to happen by October. But former Prime Minister Sir John Major says it's unwise and unsustainable for him to remain in office for the next 3 months. During his resignation speech, Boris Johnson referred to the UK's support for Ukraine as one of the key achievements of his premiership and vowed to support their fight for freedom for as long as it takes. That as G20 foreign ministers are in Bali in Indonesia this week for a meeting that's focusing on the war in Ukraine. It's the first time foreign ministers are coming face-to-face with Russia's Sergei Lavrov since the start of the invasion back in February. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace says UK support for Ukraine will continue despite Boris Johnson's resignation.
You know, the assistance to Ukraine we give is not just one person, you know, not me, not the Prime Minister, it's the whole effort. Actions matter in all of this. And, you know, while the Prime Minister will be incredibly sad to leave this post, he has led from the front on Ukraine, as he had on COVID and obviously Brexit. And I think that isn't lost on many people. But the whole of the political system is supportive of what we're doing in Ukraine. I don't expect that to finish at all.
The UK money watchdog's warning Britain's public finances are unsustainable. It's suggesting tax rises are needed to offset the rising cost of living. The Office for Budget Responsibility says government debt is at risk of more than trebling in 50 years' time. And strike action by hundreds of British Airways staff at Heathrow Airport has been suspended after the airline agreed to improve their pay. Workers at Heathrow demanded a reversal of a 10% wage cut during the pandemic, but the union says an agreement was reached after extensive talks today. The pay offer will now go to union members for a ballot. TV online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy $1.20 US and 1.178 euros. The price of gold currently stands at £1,456.31 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Well, the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, you heard it just a few moments ago in the bulletin there, has been just speaking and says British military support for Ukraine will persist in spite of Boris Johnson's resignation.
Obviously, I know you're not going to say anything, but I'm going to ask the question anyway, just for the sake of it. There's political turmoil back in Westminster. The PM's going to resign. Are you going to run for Prime Minister?
Let's see what the Prime Minister says. He's still the Prime Minister. He's going to make a statement at 12:30, and after that statement, then be happy to talk to people.
And obviously, there is a national crisis, political crisis at the moment, and yet Ukraine, as the Prime Minister keeps saying, is a huge priority. Is there a risk that the political quagmire in Westminster at the moment will impact on the UK's support to Ukraine?
I don't think there's a risk at all. I mean, I have strived throughout this process to build a cross-party consensus on Ukraine, and I've been very lucky that I've been supported by everyone from the SNP, the Labour Party, the leader of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats in our policy towards Ukraine, and I think that is going from strength to strength. There's not a week that goes by where I either don't reach out to them or talk to those parties, but also that we agree that it is important to continue the effort to support Ukraine as it strives to defend itself from this awful illegal invasion.
But given that Ukraine regards the UK with such high esteem, and there's that personal bond between President Zelensky and Boris Johnson, President Zelensky must be looking at London and seeing what's happening and wondering what's happening to his key ally. What can you say to reassure them?
Well, I think he knows, because he's been visited by a range of parliamentarians, and as has my counterpart, the Defence Minister, that Britain is full square behind them. And, the assistance to Ukraine we give is not just one person, not me, not the Prime Minister, it's the whole effort. Actions matter in all of this. And, while the Prime Minister will be incredibly sad to leave this post, he has led from the front on Ukraine, as he had on COVID and obviously Brexit, and I think that isn't lost on many people. But the whole of the political system is supportive of what we're doing in Ukraine. I don't expect that to finish at all.
The Prime Minister, in his manifesto, made a manifesto commitment when he was running ahead of the general election not to cut the British Army, not to cut the British forces in any shape or form. Do you think the next Prime Minister would need to make a similar commitment on the armed forces?
Look, I think the next Prime Minister needs to make sure they commit to investing in defence. People can argue about how that investment went, but this Prime Minister was the first Prime Minister in a generation to actually reverse taking money out of defence and putting it into investment. The record £24 billion has gone into defence for a 4-year period, and that's the first time, mostly in most people's generation, of a proper return to investment. Until then, from 1991 and the options for change when I was serving, Chancellor after Chancellor after Chancellor took a peace dividend. Problem is, they kept taking it when the world got more dangerous. Prime Minister reversed that. I'll look to whoever is the next Prime Minister to make sure they continue to invest in our defence.
Well, it took more than 50 members of his government to resign. Letters of no confidence and cabinet members directly calling for him to go during a meeting inside Number 10 last night. But Boris Johnson has resigned as Conservative Party leader. At 12:30 today, he made this speech. If you missed it, here it is.
Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom. And if we can do that in this country, we will be the most prosperous in Europe. And in the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much, and when we have such a vast mandate, and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. And our brilliant and Darwinian system will produce another leader equally committed to taking this country forward through tough times, not just helping families to get through it, but changing and improving the way we do things, cutting burdens on businesses and families, and yes, cutting taxes, because that is the way to generate the growth and the income we need to pay for great public services. And to that new leader, I say, whoever he or she may be, I say I will give you as much support as I can. And to you, the British public, I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. I want to thank Carrie and our children and all the members of my family who have had to put up with so much for so long. I want to thank the peerless British civil service for all the help and support that you have given our police, our emergency services, and of course our fantastic NHS, who at critical moment helped to extend my own period in office, as well as our armed services and our agencies that are so admired around the world, and our indefatigable Conservative Party members and supporters, whose selfless campaigning makes our democracy possible. I want to thank the wonderful staff here at Chequers, here at Number 10, and of course at Chequers, and our fantastic prop force detectives, the one group, by the way, who never leak. Above all, I want to thank you, the British public, for the immense privilege that you have given me. And I want you to know that from now on until the new Prime Minister is in place, your interests will be served and the government of the country will be carried on. Being Prime Minister is an education in itself. I've travelled to every part of the United Kingdom, and in addition to the beauty of our natural world, I found so many people possessed of such boundless British originality and so willing to tackle old problems in new ways that I know that even if things can sometimes seem dark now, our future together is golden. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Emails and reaction from Edinburgh very soon. Let's just get the thoughts and reaction to that speech from earlier today, 3 and more hours ago, from Joanne Adler, Conservative commentator, occasional contributor to political speeches as well. As an act of political speech writing, what did that tell you?
Well, I thought it was a skillful speech, but it didn't really feel like the speech that you might have expected from any other politician at a moment such as this. This was really more like a party conference speech. It felt like somebody laying out an agenda. That said, I don't agree with those people that are saying, oh, he didn't show enough contrition, he should have been a lot more apologetic. I think that in that phrase about nobody is indispensable, that was him really conceding that he's not indispensable.
And for some people, the sort of humility they want to see is an act of literal harry-carry. I mean, you know, just words will never cut it for some of his enemies.
This is exactly the point about that speech. If you were a fan of Boris Johnson's, if you were somebody that was inclined to be a fan of Boris Johnson's, then I think that speech would have been a very effective one. If, on the other hand, you're on the other side of that Marmite equation that we've often heard him described as, then no, I mean, that would only make you sort of despise him even more. It was a typical speech for him, really, but I thought it was actually skillfully put together. And the fact that he was able to sort of say, look, you know, I've played a part in taking this country forward, given that he wants to remain in office for the next 3 months, given that he wants to write a legacy, given that he wants to pass something on correctly to whoever takes over from him, I felt the tone was, on the whole, appropriate.
OK. Joanne, for now, thanks very much indeed. More emails then. Malcolm says the total irony of this is that for months, cabinet ministers have supported him. Now where are they? Politics is a dirty game. Certainly is. Darryl says Starmer will never be the people's prime minister like Boris. Blair, Mark II, and that man is hated by the majority. Russell says worst prime minister in a while. Had an 80-seat majority, could pretty much push through any law change he wished and did nothing with it. His supporters would say there was the small matter of a pandemic. Rich says Boris has led the way like a shining light. He did Brexit, vaccines and smashed Labour in the 2019 election. Away from the Westminster bubble, the Prime Minister's resignation will change politics across the whole of the UK, at least in time. In Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon has said Mr Johnson's decision will bring, as she put it, widespread relief, and added that the last few days descended into a complete and utter farce. Let's turn to our Scotland reporter, David Donaldson, to reflect on what, if anything, this means for the SNP's ambition for a second referendum. Davey, I wonder whether actually there will be those having a cup of tea or something stronger in Edinburgh today who'll rather miss a posh, tough old Etonian. He was the perfect SNP punch bag.
He certainly was, there's no doubt about that at all. Lots of strong words between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, especially over Indy Ref 2. Boris Johnson, of course, not entertaining it at all. And Nicola Sturgeon on a course of action that she says is perfectly legitimate and intends to fully try to get that to happen. Of course, the problem now is that the UK government is in a state of complete and utter disarray. So that's probably going to mean things are going to take even longer should it happen at all. So, yeah, although I'm sure Nicola Sturgeon, she said you're glad to see the back of him, like most people are in Scotland, given there's only 6 Conservative MPs in the whole country, it does cause a problem of its own in terms of Indy Ref 2 and the process and how long that will now take. So, yeah, I mean, we still heard from Nicola Sturgeon earlier on some of her words saying that, you know, she was glad to see the back of him, that she obviously said it was a widespread sense of relief because that's really what it is. And when speaking to most people here earlier today, they shared the same view.
I'm delighted, absolutely delighted. I think it is embarrassment. I think he puts Britain in a really bad light. He's got awful manners. I just think he should have gone a long time ago.
It has been a long time coming. It's long overdue, and it's only the man's arrogance that's kept him where he is for as long as he has been, in the face of his own party and the 1922 committee telling him to leave.
Yeah, he can't. He's quite happy to go through all that for to break up a union with the European Union, but obviously we're that much a burden, he can't cut us free, so for a free Scotland it's good news.
Yeah, well, we heard a lot from people there saying they're glad to see the back of him indeed. And just to reiterate Nicola Sturgeon's statement, the chaos and complete lack of integrity that has characterised Boris Johnson's premiership has in the last few days descended into complete and utter farce, and all at a time when people in every part of the UK are struggling with real challenges. So not alone there, Anna Sarwar, the Labour leaders, also came out and said this is a party that is rotten to the core, that allowed a cheat, charlatan, a man devoid of any principles or any values to become Prime Minister of this country. So as you can see, not a lot of love for Boris Johnson north of the border. I think most people here are glad that he's gone. I suppose the big question now is who replaces him. We've still to hear from Douglas Ross, of course, the Conservative leader in Scotland. I'm likely to be speaking to him later this afternoon to get his thoughts. Remember, he's the man who backed Boris Johnson, had a U-turn and then backed him again and then came out and said that he should go. So it will be interesting to see what he's got to say later on this afternoon.
Be interesting to hear from Ruth Davidson as well, wouldn't it? Somebody who for a while was tipped as a potential future British Prime Minister before turning her back on politics. David, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. We're talking about potential candidates for what is soon going to be a vacancy at number 10. Is Penny Mordaunt. She's the MP for Portsmouth North and current Minister of State for Trade Policy. How serious are her prospects, do we think? Let's go to our reporter, Jeff Moody, who covers that particular patch. Jeff is not there. Jeff's not there. In the absence of Jeff, let me turn back to Joanne Adler. He is there. Too late. I'm going to talk to Joanne Adler. It would be rude not to, having introduced her. Do you remember Ruth Davidson?
Well, I think Ruth Davidson would be seen as something of a divisive figure now because she has been so personally critical of Boris Johnson. And I'm not sure that her very, very pro-EU stance would really be able to make her a possible contender for leader, even if she were an MP. So I think that's a bit of a left field suggestion, literally and metaphorically. Penny Mordaunt is a more compelling personality, I think. I think we need to hear.
What's she like?
Well, I think we need to hear a bit more from her about what her policy agenda would be. But I mean, she's obviously a very charismatic person, and she's not tainted, if that's the right word, by having been in the cabinet. So I think that she will definitely have a prominent role to play in the leadership election. Whether people understand enough about her yet for her to be a potential winner, I don't know about that.
Ruth Davidson, forget it. Penny Mordaunt, maybe. Liz Truss has her fans. I'm just rattling through the potential female candidates. Why is Priti Patel at 50-1 and seen as totally out of the running?
Well, I think Priti Patel's been, she's had a very sort of loyal following amongst the party membership, but she has had a rather difficult time in the Home Office. She hasn't really been able to deliver on the key promises, and obviously this latest policy over Rwanda has yet to actually appear to have any practical application. But, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I would expect to see her running as a candidate. I mean, we really could potentially see pretty much the whole of the cabinet throwing their hats in.
On that note, Joanne, we'll park that thought. Let's go back to the thought about Penny Mordaunt, her constituency in Portsmouth. There we find GB News reporter Jeff Moody. Hi to you, Jeff. What do you know?
Well, I've been hearing the whole gamut of emotions this morning. Everyone has different opinions. Some people are saying good riddance. One lady said to me 3 words, I hate him. But also a lot of support and sympathy for Boris. A lot of people saying they feel that he had a tough time of it, that he's been the victim of all sorts of slurs and that he's the best man for the job. One person said to me, show me a politician who doesn't lie and I'll show you a unicorn. Well, the other big quote of the morning, of course, is Boris Johnson himself saying when the herd moves, it moves, but we don't know as yet in which direction that herd is moving. It could be moving towards Penny Mordaunt. This is her constituency in Portsmouth North. She's been very quiet on the subject. She did tweet this morning and say, our institutions are strong. Remember, they got us through Brexit. There will be a resolution to this. Meanwhile, we need to reassure partners that there is stability. I'm not too sure that stability is the word du jour, Colin, but maybe it is. But no sense yet as to whether she's going to run or not. So why is she the bookies' joint favourite alongside Rishi Sunak? Well, partly it's because of her impressive portfolio, the work that she has done since becoming an MP in 2010. As you said, she's the International Trade Minister. She's also the Ministerial Disability Champion. And she did have a stint, very briefly, albeit, as Defence Secretary, our only female Defence Secretary, employed by Theresa May, but then promptly sacked by Boris Johnson when he first came into office. We're not quite sure why she was sacked in that first cabinet reshuffle. Rumours and speculation that there was a rift between her and Boris. She did support Jeremy Hunt in the leadership campaign after Mrs May left, so it might be some residue from that. But I think, interestingly, like Rishi Sunak, she's kept her powder dry and her nose clean. You haven't seen her berating Boris. You haven't seen her commenting at all, really, on what's been happening over the last few days. And that puts me in mind of John Major. When Margaret Thatcher was ousted back in 1990, John Major was very, very quiet to start with, leaving all the fireworks and the froth to Michael Heseltine. John Major kept very quiet and gently slipped into that slot. And that's the thought, maybe, that it's prudent that she's not saying anything at the moment. How long she does keep her powder dry and her nose clean, who knows?
Jeff Moody, fascinating stuff. Thanks very much indeed. Jeff Moody's thoughts there on the prospects for Penny Mordaunt, Portsmouth MP and Defence Minister. A counterblast to that comes from somebody who will remain nameless but knows me well enough to send me a text directly, who says Penny M is so woke, massively pro-trans, would be a cause of civil war within the Tory party. Brace yourself for lots of briefing, both for and against candidates over the next few weeks and months. Emails. Sue says the Conservative Party should be careful what they wish for. The United States got rid of Trump and got Biden. Carol says, once again, members of Parliament have plotted to overturn the will of the British people. We may as well live in Russia, as our votes count for nothing. Irene says, we just want to add our support to Boris. In our opinion, he's not a liar and has been attacked by the media relentlessly and unfairly. The Tory rebels should be ashamed of themselves, and there are no words for the way certain members of the liaison committee dealt with Boris yesterday. It's all about Brexit. Let me just turn to Joanne Adler. On that point about lying and indeed the way the liaison committee dealt with the Prime Minister yesterday, I think there will have been a few people, Joanne, I was one of them, who felt a little bit uncomfortable about the dignity of the office being reduced by people. And actually, when people say, you know, the lying charge, routinely, reflexively trotted out now, and his critics will say, he's done that, to which I would sometimes say, well, you know what? Maybe it's because, as a journalist, I feel a bit uncomfortable with accusing somebody of being a liar. It's a really defamatory thing to say. Who's lowering the tone here, the liar or the people who are accusing him of lying?
I think that word is, it should have a much higher bar, an evidential bar, which, frankly, we seem to have dropped way below. We do see a lot of very cavalier use of language.
Yeah. Including by journalists, by the way, including by broadcast journalists.
Very often by journalists, unfortunately. But, yeah, I didn't watch all of the proceedings yesterday, but I did catch some of it. And I actually thought that a lot of the MPs were bringing themselves into disrepute. It really was a witch hunt. It seemed like they were just competing with each other to come up with the more over-the-top charge and the more sort of embittered criticism. I don't think anybody came out of it particularly well.
Just time for a couple more emails. There's loads coming in. I'm trying to share as many of as I possibly can. John says the Lib Dems, Labour and Russia are all overjoyed at Boris's resignation. The Tories who stabbed him in the back should feel ashamed of themselves. Never has a Prime Minister won a general election on his own before. We'll bring you up to date with all the comings and goings in Downing Street. There have been a number of ministers leaving Downing Street in the last few minutes. The business of government kind of goes on as normal today, but it's been a very different kind of day. We'll reflect on it at the top of the next hour. News first with Ray.
Good afternoon. It's just past 4 o'clock. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. Boris Johnson has resigned as leader of the Conservative Party. Addressing the country outside Number 10, he said it's clearly the will of his party. The Prime Minister said he's deeply saddened to be giving up the best job in the world, explaining he fought to remain because he felt it was his duty. The decision to step down follows 3 days of government revolt that's seen almost 60 MPs, including 5 cabinet ministers, quit. Boris Johnson says he will continue to serve as Prime Minister until the party chooses his successor, which is expected to happen by October.
I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much and when we have such a vast mandate and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Well, Boris Johnson's leadership has come under increased scrutiny in recent months following a number of scandals. He tried to protect former MP Owen Paterson, who repeatedly broke lobbying rules by attempting to overhaul the MP's standard system. He also faced cross-party criticism for attending gatherings in Whitehall during lockdown for which he was fined in April. And most recently, he was found to have promoted MP Chris Pincher to the Tory Whip's office, despite being aware of previous allegations of sexual misconduct. Meanwhile, Downing Street's announced the cabinet reshuffle to replace those who've either been resigned or been sacked. Kit Malthouse has been appointed Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster. That's the most senior position after the Prime Minister. James Cleverly is the new Education Secretary. Robert Buckland, the new Welsh Secretary. Shailesh Vara, the new Northern Ireland Secretary. And Greg Clark has replaced Michael Gove as Levelling Up Secretary, saying he'll do his best to provide stability in government. Meanwhile, former Technologies Minister Chris Philp has said he will return to government if required now that Boris Johnson has agreed to resign. During his resignation speech, Boris Johnson referred to the UK's support for Ukraine as one of the key achievements of his premiership and vowed to support their fight for freedom for as long as it takes. In a phone call to Ukraine's president this afternoon, he vowed the UK would continue to supply vital defensive aid for as long as needed. He ended the call by praising President Zelensky, saying, "You're a hero, everybody loves you." That comes as G20 foreign ministers meet in Bali, Indonesia this week for a meeting that will focus on the war in Ukraine. It'll be the first time foreign ministers meet Russia's Sergei Lavrov since the start of the invasion back in February. Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has also said UK support for Ukraine will continue despite Boris Johnson's resignation.
You know, the assistance to Ukraine we give is not just one person, you know, not me, not the Prime Minister, it's the whole effort. Actions matter in all of this. And, you know, while the Prime Minister will be incredibly sad to leave this post, he has led from the front on Ukraine, as he had on COVID and obviously Brexit. And I think that isn't lost on many people. But the whole of the political system is supportive of what we're doing in Ukraine. I don't expect that to finish at all.
And strike action by hundreds of British Airways staff at Heathrow Airport has been suspended after the airline agreed to improve their pay. Workers at Heathrow demanded a reversal of a 10% wage cut during the pandemic, but the union says an agreement was reached after extensive talks. The pay offer will now go to union members for a ballot. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's get back to Colin Brazier.
Well, a very good afternoon to you. The Prime Minister is, we're told, carrying on with his duties in Downing Street this afternoon after resigning as Conservative Party leader and effectively resigning as Prime Minister this morning. He'll officially resign, he hopes, a little later on this year and hand over to somebody else. There are those who want him to leave on the instant. We'll have a conversation about that very shortly. But there he was this morning, a succession of apparent scandals and over 50 resignations brought about this moment.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom.
Well, that's the key part from the speech. If you want to see the whole thing, go to the GB News website. You'll be able to have a look at it there in full. Let's go to Downing Street then, speak to GB News' political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who's still standing after a long 24 hours in Mordaunt. And actually, there is still business happening in number 10, maybe not as usual, but there hasn't been some cessation of political activity.
No, there hasn't. In fact, actually, we've just had a cabinet meeting. I have to say it was very short and sweet. Ministers went in just before 3 o'clock. They were emerging about 25 minutes later, and clearly it is a change cabinet. Because remember, there's been a whole series of appointments today. Normally a cabinet reshuffle would be dominating the news. We've got a new education secretary in James Cleverly. We've got a new levelling up secretary in Greg Clark, a new Wealth secretary in Robert Buckland. It goes on and on. Obviously some familiar faces as well. Dominic Raab was there, Grant Shapps still the Transport Secretary, Nadine Dorris still the Cultural Secretary, but there is very much a sense here in Downing Street that is a caretaker government, given the fact the attention is now turning from here to the Commons and to those runners and riders who will try and grab the leadership of the Conservative Party over the coming weeks. It is interesting, isn't it, when you listen to the Prime Minister, Colin, and what he had to say, because we're talking today about him resigning, and he's clearly going to go. But he never actually mentioned those words. He said, I have today appointed a cabinet to serve as I will until a new leader is in place. And I say that because this is where the real political tension is at the moment within the Conservative Party. There are those that are willing and keen to give the Prime Minister the space that he clearly wants to carry on until October and the party conference. But there are others, and quite a few of them, Conservative MPs, who essentially want to see him go as soon as possible. It'll be interesting to see how that battle plays out in the days to come. Suggestions that many within the Conservative Party want this leadership race at the parliamentary stage, so where it's whittled down to just 2 candidates who go to the membership, to be settled before the summer recess, which is in less than 2 weeks at time. So it's going to be a very dramatic week next week, in which we're going to see a lot of candidates put their names forwards, and MPs, the Conservative MPs, have a chance to whittle those down to 2 in which the membership will vote on. Who will it be? Lots of them haven't officially announced whether they're going to run or not, but people like Ben Wallace, we mentioned, Liz Truss, will Rishi Sunak run, Tom Tugendhat, Penny Mordaunt. There's a whole endless list of names. It'll be fascinating to see who's going to gather that support and who, frankly, in a relatively short period of time, will be the new incumbent of number 10.
Darren, thanks very much indeed. Darren McCaffrey. With me in the studio, the former Home Office and Transport Minister for the Liberal Democrats, Norman Baker. Norman, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Well, let's start wrong way round. If you were a Tory, who would you go for?
I would go for a safe pair of hands, first of all, and I would go for someone that was able to regain the middle ground for the Conservatives, because they're losing it big time, not least of all to my old party, in places like Tiverton and Honiton. But however,
Jeremy Hunt, Tom Tugendhat?
Well, I think probably is a good, smart choice, but I have to say that historically, the Tory electorate tends to go for someone on the right. They chose Ian Duncan Smith, for example, over Ken Clarke, and that may have been a kind of gut reaction, but in terms of who was going to win the popular vote, that was the wrong decision. So I think they ought to think carefully about who they choose, because that person has to appeal to the electorate at large rather than to the gut instinct. In the same way as the Labour Party should never have chosen Jeremy Corbyn. They need to choose someone from the centre.
Yeah, the parliamentary party can finesse the process in the sense that they can present to the 100,000 Conservative Party members 2 candidates who are electable. And there were rule changes to make that
the
can.
Thing. And, of course, the Tory MPs are probably better informed than the Tory electorate out there. And some of it will be about making sure that the person they don't want is not on the ballot paper.
Yeah. To that speech, what did you make of that speech?
Well, it was valedictory, wasn't it? It was all the things he'd done. I'm not saying he hasn't achieved things. He certainly has led on...
If he's not going to say that there, then when is he going to say it?
Well, indeed so. And he led on Ukraine. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for that, for example. But I have to say that, the last few days have been unedifying. They've been an attempt to prize him out of office. He's held on. He's had 50 resignations, unprecedented from his ministers. He's had MPs on his own side dissing him in the House of Commons, on the floor of the Commons. And he's been, I think, seen to have misled Parliament, to have lied, and to have behaved in a way that is not appropriate for a Prime Minister. I've seen Prime Ministers of Labour and Tory, going back to Mrs Thatcher in my political days. I've not seen one behave in this way. So I think there are many Tory MPs this afternoon, as well as others in Parliament, who think he needs to go now, including John Major, I see.
We'll maybe come on to that, and I'm sure we will come on to that. But just in terms of that sort of maelstrom that he found himself in the midst of, and there'll be books written about this,
yeah.
Probably write about it himself,
yeah.
Probably fairly soon. But just that sense of, have you ever been in that situation where you just haven't got time to draw breath, and there's a decision waiting to be made, but Prime Minister, I'm afraid it's the liaison committee you need to go and appear before.
Yes.
And now you've got a meeting with the ambassador from... at no point can you sit down and go, you know what I need to do? I need to resign.
That's the life of a minister. When I was a minister, it was like that all the time. You were juggling so many balls in the air at any one time, and you had no space often to think about what you wanted to do. That's a problem with a...
Think and talk to close confidants.
Yes. In this case, however, I was there as a researcher in the House of Commons way back in Mrs Thatcher's day, and I remember the end of Margaret Thatcher, and she was given advice she didn't want by the men in grey suits or whatever they're called, who came along and said...
She still took it.
She still took it. She took it, and actually she behaved honourably, in my view. She followed the proper rules. She understood how these things work with the Queen and everything else, and she went. And Boris Johnson didn't. He tried to hang on until the only reason he's gone now is not because he accepted that he needs to go. He's gone because he couldn't fill the ministerial positions.
Norman, for now, thanks very much indeed. Well, what do the polls say? We're going to be inundated with polls in the weeks to come, that's for sure. One pollster who joins us now is Gideon Skinner, Head of Political Research at Ipsos UK, so one of the big polling brands. Gideon, welcome to you. I think it's your poll that I've been looking at, which I think on another news day would be getting a lot more attention. Correct me if I'm wrong. No, it is. I think it is yours, which is showing that, well, it's good news for Rishi Sunak. Let me put it that way.
Yes, that's right. I'm glad to say that is one of ours. We asked the public after the Rishi Sunak and Sajid Javid resignations, who do they think would make a good Prime Minister? And Rishi Sunak, sort of amongst the potential Conservative candidates, leads the pack. Sajid Javid quite closely behind. But at the same time, we shouldn't overstate the lead. There certainly really aren't any clear favourites as far as the wider public is concerned. There's a lot of neutral opinions out there. There's still as many negative opinions, and there's lots of don't know. So it's very early days yet, but the public can still change their minds about really all of the contenders.
There's one that jumps out at me, and I have to say, on a personal level, I'm quite a fan of Priti Patel, but mine is very much a minority opinion. The people you've polled, 53% of them have either a very or fairly bad opinion of the job she's doing. On the basis of this poll, the Home Secretary is out of the running already.
Concerned, Priti Patel and Michael Gove both tend to get more negative ratings. They do stand out, but as you say, I'm not sure how much they're being talked about as potential candidates. But there's a big group of potential candidates in the middle. Penny Mordaunt, you've been talking about, Ben Wallace and others, where the public is still to make their minds up about them. They've got relatively low levels of public awareness, and these things can change, and the public will change their minds once someone actually becomes Prime Minister as well. We saw that with Boris Johnson. He was getting pretty low ratings on some of these metrics, even just in early 2019, just a few months before he became Prime Minister. But, it changes once you take on the office itself.
And, Gideon, I'm not for a second suggesting these polls are useless. I mean, we'd have nothing to talk about if we didn't have polls. But in the sense that they are reflecting what the public think, but the public do not have a dog yet. Well, they've got a dog in this fight, but they don't have a vote in it. So you've got two constituencies. You've got the bigger one, eventually, who decide on the between the two candidates, 100,000 Conservative Party members. And then you've got the really tiny one, which has all the influence of 300-plus MPs. But they will look at your figures, and their decision-making will be partly informed by that.
Yes, you'd like to think so. I mean, of course, they're the ones who have the decision, Conservative MPs and party members, and they will be taking their views on kind of a range of different things. I mean, for example, the likelihood of the new Prime Minister being able to win the next election probably plays more of a role for Conservative MPs and party members than it does for members of the public. They just want a Prime Minister who will do a good job. But there is overlap. The sorts of things that the public say they want to see from a Prime Minister are aspects like understanding the problems facing Britain, are honest, are good in a crisis, is a capable leader, and many of those will be shared by party members and MPs as well.
Gideon, really good to talk to you. Appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll be hearing lots more from you in coming weeks. For now, though, thanks very much indeed. Well, Boris Johnson, man behind a landslide victory for the Conservatives 2019, 3 years ago, winning over 40% of the popular vote, as he reminded us today, the highest percentage for any party since 1979, and what was, at least for a while, an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, taking red wall strongholds from parts of the industrial north and elsewhere that seemed to really belong to Labour in perpetuity. He's also the man behind Brexit, to some degree. I think that's probably rather overwritten. Brexit was very much the work of many people, wasn't it? The vaccination rollout, and he's been seen as a leading figure in support for Ukraine internationally. After his resignation, how do you, the voters, feel now? Alice Porter joins us from Boris Johnson's constituency of Uxbridge. Alice, welcome to you. What are you hearing?
Good afternoon. Well, I have to say, when the news came out at 12:30 that Boris Johnson was being outside and going to be speaking, announcing his resignation, we were all in the Chime shopping centre to the left of me, with lots of people all watching it. And I have to say, the opinion from people in his constituency was very mixed. Some people were walking past and tutting and obviously not a big fan. And there were other people who come up to me and say they're absolutely devastated by the news and say he's been a terrific MP locally, that he's also been a terrific Prime Minister. I think, funnily enough, an issue that kept cropping up with people saying that he's the best person for the job to be taking on Putin, and saying that many of them are concerned about who will be taking on the role afterwards when tensions in Europe are so high. I was speaking with some people when we heard the news that Boris Johnson was going to be resigning as leader of the Conservative Party, and this is what they said to me.
My reaction is we might get a constituency MP back. The problem we've had in Uxbridge, Boris Johnson was parachuted in. Somebody said to me it's helicoptered, because with a parachute you're only going down one way.
Once he got into control, he just that was it. He just couldn't care less about anybody else but himself. All these things that keep coming out, they're just dreadful.
So all the time he's been here in Uxbridge as our MP, he's been doing another major job. So he hasn't got the time to deal with constituency matters. This is the problem. We want to ask questions about why can't our police station remain open. We want to ask that question to Prime Minister's Question Time.
If you had 54 people working for a private company and they didn't want to work for the boss, who would have to go?
Well, there were some of the people in Uxbridge and South Ruislip speaking to me earlier. I think it's important to stress that he will continue to stay on as the MP for Uxbridge and Ruislip. But I think the problem is that a lot of people I was speaking to earlier say he's not actually from the area at all. As you were hearing from those people there, he was sort of parachuted in. He's not from the area. A lot of people I spoke to are frustrated and say he's not a great constituency MP, partly because, look, he's Prime Minister, right? And so he's been sort of focused on Westminster. And when I've been here in Uxbridge over the last few months, getting people's reaction to a party gate and things like that, a lot of people are sort of saying that his focus has been more in Westminster than ever and not here in his constituency. And many of them are also saying it's unlikely, given his nature, given his character, and also given the role that he's been sort of, wrangling between the UK and Ukraine and Russia. Many of them are sort of saying, well, that may be a little bit more exciting for a character like Boris Johnson than getting involved in some of the constituency work, whether it's issues to do with the police station being closed or the lack of infrastructure with new housing. That may be something that perhaps doesn't chime with some of the interest that we've seen from Boris Johnson.
For those of you wondering how the next few days, weeks, who knows, months develop in terms of this slightly grey, unwritten constitution that we have and how we work our way through times like this. Interesting line, perhaps, from Robert Buckland, former Justice Secretary, as part of that reshuffle that Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, was telling you about a moment ago. He's returned to Cabinet. He's now Welsh Secretary. He says that Boris Johnson, while still Prime Minister, though, of course, no longer leader of the Conservative Party and ready to step aside when there is a replacement, says that Boris Johnson will no longer have the authority to do new things in government, according to Robert Buckland. And I draw that to your attention because Robert Buckland, though now Welsh Secretary, is a former Justice Secretary, and he knows his way around the law. And as far as he's concerned, the Prime Minister having said what he said, Boris Johnson having said what he said, he has no authority anymore to do anything new policies, presumably. So real caretaker, interim Prime Minister, lame duck, if you prefer. Let's get some more of your viewer opinions now. We're joined by Miranda Richardson from Northamptonshire and the Reverend James Treasure, who's in Dudley, as you see. Welcome to you both. Miranda Richardson, to you, we've been struggling as trained journalists to keep up with events over the past 24 hours. As a member of the public, what say you?
Well, do you know, I think what another marvellous distraction we've all got going on. It seems to be a roller coaster of distractions to what our normal out in the public day-to-day life is like. You know, we're all here battling with filling our cars up, not being able to buy products in supermarkets, not being able to afford our bills. But in the meantime, we've got yet another distraction, which is it all kicking off at number 10 and who's going to be babysitting the country for a while. It's crazy. It's just, you know, for all of us, personally, you know, general public, it's here we go, here's something else. Throw something else at us then just to take our minds off it. It's crazy.
Reverend James Treasure, your thoughts today?
I think mixed emotions, really. I think he's done the right thing in resigning. He didn't have an option, but it was the right thing to do as well. But also missed opportunities. He had such a mandate and such a majority that he really, if he had a vision beyond getting Brexit done, I think, granted the pandemic got in the way, but I think we could have seen more from him and hopefully something decent for our nation. But in the end, it was his character, I think, that let him down.
Reverend, can I just ask you another question? I ask it because you are wearing full fig, as it were, so you're not talking to me as a civilian or a layperson, but as a cleric. And I wonder, given some of the interventions of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was really pretty strident on things like that Rwanda policy, and how you, as a sort of foot soldier of the Church of England, then translate that to what, you know, your homilies on a weekly basis from the pulpit. Has it been difficult for you?
It's an interesting question because clearly the senior team, as it were, of the Anglican Church were very critical of Boris, and I share some of those criticisms that they had of him. But it is difficult. The challenge is how do you translate that into everyday life, particularly in a place like Dudley that went Tory, actually, it voted Tory, was Labour and switched. So there were some challenges, but you know, you're always listening to other voices, I think, within that.
Miranda, when you talk to friends about this, colleagues, people who are interested or pretty apathetic to, as befits their particular personality, what's coming across from the people you know? Are they saying, as many of our email correspondents are, that this is cooked up by mainstream media, doesn't reflect the majority of public opinion, or he's had it coming, he's been a disaster, or somewhere in between?
Yeah, somewhere in between. It's funny because in my very different church of running a pub and having my guest, if you like, you know, it's quite mixed. The conversations that have been going on in the pub, it's, you know, talking about how anybody else could have done the job better and how the last couple of years have looked, and you know, everybody just seems to be again, like I think one of the constituents in Uxbridge said, you know, if 54 people walk out on you, who's going to go? You know, and I think that's quite evident. It's like anything. If you're doing a really, really bad job, and it's kind of come across in how it's been, you can't carry on that. You can't pretend that the world around you is wrong and you're right. You know, you've got to sort of step back and go, well, maybe I need to look at this. And when people are dropping like flies around you, you've got to have a closer look. And that seems to be the general feeling, and the chat in the pub at the moment is kind of along those lines, that actually perhaps should have gone. again, they're all very, balanced on how they feel about how the last couple of years have gone. And we know with COVID and the pandemic, nobody could have planned that. Nobody could have done an even better job. It's been hit and miss the entire journey, and it will continue to be. I think it's what we've got to look at now is, I think, as they said, who is strong enough to go forward and continue to be strong in leading us out of the hole that we're kind of aspiring into at the moment as a nation.
I would have thought the pub and the church have got plenty in common, full of sinners, and you both serve wine. But just one final. I'm presuming you serve wine, Miranda. Just one final thought, just quickly. Look, early runners and riders, nobody's officially declaring, even less putting the telephone lines in for a campaign. But as you look at alternatives to the Prime Minister, who would currently get your nod? James Treasure.
I don't think any of them will get too many nods from me, but I think I would probably at this stage be a bit partial to Jeremy Hunt, who I think seems to hold a centre middle ground and has a mature head on his shoulders.
Miranda Richardson?
Yeah, I'm with you with Jeremy Hunt as well. I think Rishi Sunak came into his own criticism. Him and his. The money between him and his family, which is a side issue, obviously, but the general public will go with that, and that will be what they'll focus on. And like I say, Jeremy Hunt is quite solid there in the middle, and I think that's currently the situation we need to look at and just sit and be able to handle it, pushing forward, definitely.
OK, I'm quite taken by that, sufficiently so just to extend this by a minute or two. And James, just on Jeremy Hunt then, do you feel, I mean, that slightly feeds from the politics of lockdown, doesn't it? Because there are those who say, there he was, former Health Secretary, he was a principal critic of government policy on lockdowns. There are plenty of others, by the way, who said he had loads of time to get ready for the pandemic and did a terrible job of that. How much do you look at Jeremy Hunt through that prism of lockdown, James?
Interesting question. A little bit, but I think what often happens with leadership, isn't it? You want someone who's a bit different than the last one you had. So I think I'm conscious of that dynamic at play, where you think you've had the bluff and the buster and the charisma of Johnson, which perhaps that's what we needed at some point. But Jeremy brings a bit more of a groundedness and a thoughtfulness to the situation, which I think probably we could do with at the moment as a nation. I think a bit of a sigh of relief. Bit of normality. I would have said Rory Stewart if he was still in the party. That's he would have got my interest. I think my nod.
Yeah, very interesting. Reverend James Treasure and Miranda Richardson. Let's hope we see you again. Really interesting conversations. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.
We're going to go to Downing Street. Nigel Farage is there. Nigel. Nigel, I hope you can hear me. You're in there.
I can.
Tell us what you see. Tell us what you think. Give us a sense of the moment.
Well, it's becoming a regular occurrence, of course, isn't it? We had 2016 with David Cameron, 2019 with Theresa May, and now today with Boris Johnson. Extraordinary that it should have happened 3 times in the space of 6 years. I know Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, finds the whole thing a bit surreal. It's a funny one, isn't it? I mean, it's been inevitable for the last 48 hours that it had to happen. The whole position was becoming untenable. It's interesting. I mean, obviously Boris Johnson being criticised for the speech that he gave, not showing enough humility, but I don't know. I think give the guy his moment. I mean, it clearly very difficult circumstances for him personally. Whether the Conservative Party will learn the lessons from this, I just don't know. I mean, to me, on the politics of it, they were elected as a Conservative Party. They governed as a metropolitan Liberal Party on a whole range of issues. Will they learn the lesson? And when it comes to truth, integrity and honesty, well, they've got to find someone that restores that. But they need to do it very, very quickly. And my sense of it, Colin, my sense of it is the idea that he stays as Prime Minister for the next 10 weeks or whatever it may be. I think that's going to start to fracture very early next week. Darren, have Tory MPs spoken out already and said it's not tenable for him to go on, and maybe Dominic Raab should step up?
So there is this real discussion, isn't there, within the Conservative Party about what should happen in the kind of days and weeks to come. I think there is certainly a view that it's not sustainable, that the timetable the Prime Minister seemed to be suggesting this morning that he would like to be in there until party conference, which is the start of October, is too long. This movement, where lots of Conservative MPs also feel very comfortable that he's even in there now and want him to go essentially immediately, I'm not entirely sure. I think the compromise is going to be somewhere in the middle, and people do seem to be kind of coalescing around this idea that we will see the start of this leadership contest properly on Monday, Tuesday of next week. They will get through ballots pretty quickly. Looks like the threshold to get on the ballot will be 20 Conservative MPs, and that they will whittle what will probably be a very large field down to 2 by the summer recess. Now, the summer recess is in less than 2 weeks' time.
And then a vote of the membership by post, 3 weeks to return.
In August.
So we could be looking before the bank holiday in August.
Yeah, I think like either the end of August, start of September, you then have a new Prime Minister in situ. It's kind of the plan. I think that most Conservative MPs would feel reasonably comfortable.
So they tolerate Boris Johnson staying there over the course of a summer recess.
Yeah,
That's really what you're saying.
Yeah, indeed, because that's what happened when, of course, David Cameron resigned. Yeah. He remained as Prime Minister. No, that was cut short because Andrew Leadsom dropped out of the race and Theresa May became leader. There's not really been... Because people talk about Dominic Raab, haven't they? People even talk about Theresa May coming back as an interim Prime Minister. We've never really had that in British politics before. There's never been kind of like an interim Prime Minister in between two. And I think the Prime Minister has obviously damaged himself an awful lot this week, the way that he's handled himself. But the sense is that I think what they don't want to do is damage the party even further in the division by chucking him out really suddenly.
But Cameron went and May went through policy failures. Yeah. The loss of a referendum, the failure to get a Brexit deal through, the humiliation in the European elections are coming fifth. These 59 letters talked about decency in politics, trust, honesty, integrity. If that's how they felt when they wrote the letters today or yesterday, I think it's quite difficult.
It's going to be very difficult for ministers. I mean, they still have... I mean, this morning... when Michelle Dolan resigned as Education Secretary,
after
who'd been
48 hours,
less 36 hours in the post, there was no ministers in the Department of Education. Extraordinary. There was literally not one single minister in a pretty big government department. I mean, it got to the point, this is why the Prime Minister left, the government could not function. The government was not functioning. But what's going to happen now? Are those ministers going to go back and serve under a man that you rightly pointed out they claim is distrustful, has got no integrity, and someone they're not prepared to work under? In saying that, there clearly are, we've seen that with the cabinet appointments today, James Cleverly in education, Greg Clark at Levelling Up. Greg Clark, who had the whip withdrawn from Boris Johnson back in 2019 because he defied him. There clearly are people prepared to step up and say, you know what, not a big fan of yours. Robert Buckland, a good example. He called on him to go yesterday. He's now the Welsh Secretary. But the cabinet...
it's also it's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous, but they would argue we are doing this because the cabinet and the government still have to actually function, and we're going to step up short term to do those roles.
Right, and Boris Johnson then still in charge.
Boris Johnson's still in charge, but the whole point, as you well know, the power is draining from here, from Downing Street. It's draining from here, and it's going across the road to the Palace of Westminster, because everyone's attention will now very quickly switch from this guy to the runners and riders of that leadership race. And it is absolutely fascinating who they are. I mean, we're talking about potentially the man who lives now in number 11, Nadhim Zahawi. He left the cabinet looking pretty gloom-faced, must be said, earlier on today. Rishi Sunak is currently the favourite, it seems, amongst the general public at least. But Liz Truss, who's on a plane back from Indonesia, almost certainly will run. Will Penny Mordaunt run? Will Tom Tugendhat run? Frankly...
Suella Braverman,
who walked into number 10. I did cheekily ask her whether she was going to emerge as Prime Minister. But the problem for lots of these candidates is, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's not, is frankly lots of the public don't know them. I mean, when Suella Braverman walked down the street to number 10, when she left those gates, I'm sure most people have no idea
so
who she is.
She walked through the protest, no problem.
No idea who she is, and yet there's an expectation on her part that she could be Prime Minister in a couple of months. It does seem quite extraordinary. There will be a lot of candidates, but they will get whittled down pretty quickly, I reckon.
No, they will. And one of the things Boris Johnson said was it was a very eccentric decision to get rid of a Prime Minister, not just because of his achievements, but because, despite months of sledging, to quote Boris Johnson, they were still, and being in the midterms, only a few points behind in the polls. So maybe that's a good moment to bring in Joe Twyman from Delta Poll. Joe, the snapshots of polling that I saw over the last few days indicated that over half of 2019 Conservative voters did now want the Prime Minister to resign.
Yes, that's right, and that's a reflection of the broader trends that we've been seeing in a lot of the polling, whether it comes to the question of whether Boris Johnson should resign or whether it comes to the question of simply how well or badly he's doing in his job. In Delta Poll's most recent polling, which took place just before the crisis of this week, we saw that more than half of current Conservative voters believed that the Prime Minister was doing a bad job. And that is bad in absolute terms. It's also bad in relative terms, because Keir Starmer's approval ratings on the same metrics were much, much higher. And this is a situation that had been going on for some time and really looked like it would be extremely difficult to turn around, because it's all very well ratings and other measures being poor, but when every metric, whether it's management of the economy, whether it's simply voting intention, whether it's leadership ratings, when all of those metrics point in the wrong direction, you can see why people perhaps look forward to the next election and look over their shoulder.
Yeah, no, I get that. So, I mean, the story that the Johnson loyalists have been putting out, doing the media rounds, is nearly 14 million people voted for him. It was wrong for MPs to remove him, given this massive level of support that Johnson has in the country. But your argument is that kind of half of that really is gone.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very well saying that 14 million people voted for him, but the key there is past tense. They voted for him in 2019, and since then, and of course it's worth remembering that before then he hadn't really had an opportunity to establish himself as Prime Minister at all. It'd simply been a series of arguments over Brexit and votes in the Commons that had failed to get through. Since then, we've had the COVID pandemic, where it is certainly the case that his ratings did very well. But really, since that has moved out of the main focus of public opinion, time and again, scandal after scandal, difficulty after difficulty, his ratings have really suffered. And you can see why, quite reasonably, people within the Conservative Party and outside the Conservative Party would say, well, yes, the situation in 2019 is clearly not the same as the situation in 2022.
So how far ahead in the polls as we speak would you say the Labour Party are, just now?
Well, right now we don't know, because there hasn't been any voting intention polling since the resignation. What we know historically is that actually resignations of party leaders recently, so David Cameron and Theresa May, they didn't have much of an impact on the party's ratings. When Boris Johnson actually became leader, so after Theresa May's resignation and after the leadership election, we did see an improvement in the Conservatives' fortunes, but only by about 4 or 5%. And so at the moment, I would say Labour are probably between 8 and 10% ahead, which is where they've been up until this moment. And really, the results have so far remained unchanged since the local elections.
Final thought, Joe, if I may. Darren McCaffrey, our political editor, was just saying that Suella Braverman, somebody that holds senior office, Attorney General in this government, walked down Downing Street into the crowd earlier and no one knew who she was. Isn't that going to be a potential problem, that any of the people potentially that could win the crown from Boris Johnson just aren't known for the general public?
That's certainly true. People have been asking about, well, what do the polls say about who's best placed to replace Boris Johnson? And the answer is that in most cases, more than half of people say they don't know, because they don't recognise those names. Because if they do recognise those names, the people are famous perhaps only for one thing. And so, really, all of those polls are meaningless. The battle for leadership starts now, and as each of the candidates puts their arguments across, tries to get noticed, that will have an impact on the polls. Up until now, nothing's happened, but up until now, it's all been hypothetical.
Joe Twyman, I agree with that completely. Ignore any polls you see in the short term. Ignore bookmakers' odds. They mean nothing until this campaign begins. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand you over now to Tom Harwood, who is over there on College Green, just down the road.
Yes, Nigel, it's a veritable throng of politicians still spilling around here on College Green. Everyone has their piece to say, and clearly it has been an incredibly momentous day in politics. It's one of those days where all the various tents pop up here on this small patch of grass outside Parliament, where politicians say their piece and much speculation takes place about what will happen next, because that's where the conversation is moving to at this point in time. That's where everyone is looking forward to. Most people are ignoring the sort of conspiracy theories that abound on social media about how Boris Johnson might stay on forever. Clearly, what is happening now is an orderly transition of power. Yes, Boris Johnson staying on for several weeks until that next party leader is picked. There has been some suggestion, not least from the leader of the opposition and indeed some backbench Conservatives, that Boris Johnson should stand down in favour of a caretaker Prime Minister. That initial speculation does seem, if anything, to be dampening down now. We're going to see the words of the 1922 committee executive at the start of next week, laying out that timetable for this leadership election. And since 2001, the way that Tory leadership elections have worked is the members of Parliament whittle it down to just 2 candidates, and then those 2 candidates go out to the Conservative Party membership, a group of between 100,000 and around 160,000 people, we think. The last time it was counted, it was 160,000. We don't quite know the movement of how many party members have moved on or joined since then, but it's going to be within that region who decide between those final 2 candidates. Last time round, it took 46 days since the resignation of Theresa May to the appointment of Boris Johnson. Will it be a 46-day period this time? Well, who's to say? What we do understand, however, is that Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, wants the parliamentary process of this leadership election, i.e. the whittling down to those just 2 candidates from what stands to be now a very, very broad field of candidates, many of whom, as you've been discussing, may not be the biggest household names in the world. Well, that process of whittling down to just 2 candidates, the 1922 committee hopes will be done by the time of recess. So just a couple of weeks to go, really, for that process to take place. In 2019, that process was MPs voting every Tuesday and every Thursday to whittle it down one by one, or indeed, if people wanted to drop out in between those votes, more than that. Perhaps we'll see more regular votes, given the short amount of time until recess, and then, of course, the contest is taken out to the country, and that might be the more exciting media-focused element of this contest. Perhaps hustings taking place across the country, but certainly it seems by the autumn, likely by September, there'll be a new Prime Minister.
Coming. What is the kind of expectation there among Conservative MPs about what may well happen in terms of the candidates, the number of votes they're going to get, the supporters that are currently behind them, and just how quickly and where the membership might be on the final 2?
Yes, Darren, I didn't catch the beginning of your question there, but I think that was a question about the amount of time that it might take and the number of candidates that might stand. At the moment, at least a dozen names are being discussed amongst members of Parliament and indeed commentators. Nascent campaign teams getting underway, beginning indeed. Some of those campaign teams being made up of the former special advisors to those members of Parliament who left the cabinets just recently, and really we're going to be seeing some of these names pop to the fore, start making appearances, maybe even campaign launches in the next 7 days. Because of this expedited process of whittling down to those final 2, we might well see some pretty speedy campaign announcements. Getting together those campaigns is never an easy feat. We already know that various MPs are putting their backing publicly behind some potential candidates. But in terms of the big beasts, those who have the strongest chance of getting down to those final two, perhaps we should be expecting some leadership campaign launch events as early as next week.
So thank you very much indeed, just on the road there. Nigel, it is interesting, isn't it, that, you know, for all the criticism of Boris Johnson about his integrity, there were also lots and lots of criticism about what he stood for. You know, I've said this repeatedly, you know, we knew what Thatcherism was, we knew what Blairism was. You might not like it, you might agree with it, whatever. No one really quite understood what Johnsonism was, beyond levelling up.
Well, I mean, I felt all the way, by the way, I still don't know what that means.
Yeah.
You know,
it just means making the country better.
Is levelling up giving opportunity? Is it spending money? None of that's been really made clear to me. I think the point is this: he was elected on a very conservative ticket and governed in a very liberal way. There is no doubt about it. That big shift in the Red Wall towards the Conservatives, the key issue was controlling the borders, and hence what's been going on in the Channel. Even though in real numbers it's small compared to legal immigration, just the visibility of that's caused a problem. I think the rush to net zero, the reliance on the Nimco Alleys, the Lord Goldsmiths, the trendy London set has proved to be unpopular and not particularly conservative. But I think there's a bigger thing here. You know, Brexit wasn't just about leaving the European Union. Brexit was about saying we've had enough of this cosy club in London telling us how we should live our lives. And I remember when I formed the Brexit Party, the slogan we used in those European elections wasn't even about the EU. It was change politics for good. And there was this hope and optimism that a new kind of politics would come. And I think
he had a majority of 80.
And Boris looked like, he looked so unconventional in many ways, and yet we've returned, I think, in this 2.5 years, to a chumocracy of, in the main, very entitled, very privileged people. It looked just the same, really, as the Cameron years.
So is there anyone that, when you look at that list of names, not everyone's declared yet, is there anyone who ideologically grabs you, who you think, you know what?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, you know, traditionally, I would have said Priti Patel, because I think she does believe in small states.
Yeah.
But I think she's probably too damaged, frankly, by the cross-channel crisis. You can't keep telling people...
She's also broken the ministerial code.
Yes. That's quite common these days. And then I looked at Zahawi and I thought, well, that's really interesting. He comes from outside that Eton octopus. How can so many prime ministers have gone to one school? I mean, it is, frankly, ridiculous. I looked at Zahawi, but I tell you what I found really interesting in the last few days. And she may well have walked down Downing Street and not been recognised. But Suella Braverman seems to be the only one potentially running in this race who wants to take us out of the ECHR. Because I don't see how we deal with the Channel. I don't see how we deal with 11,000 foreign criminals living on Britain's streets that should have been deported unless we deal with that problem of the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. And if Suella Braverman throws that into the campaign early next week, that's going to be very interesting.
Also really fascinating is we thought today we were going to get a big speech on the economy. That's what was planned until obviously everything fell apart. The House of Cards came crashing down. There will be pressure, I think, and the Prime Minister might want to leave a legacy now. He always alluded to that it was Rishi Sunak that was holding him back from cutting taxes. But at the same time would make an argument that now is not a time to cut taxes. Do you think we might get to that stage now over the summer where he'll go, you know what?
I think 5% VAT is going to come off fuel duty, and I think that's going to happen pretty quickly. And people will see that on their household bills when they get them in September, October this year. Yeah, that would be something he can do. But I still get back to that question earlier. You know, the Conservative MPs will allow Johnson a couple of quiet days, but by Monday, do they really still want him to be in charge for the next 10 weeks, having used the words they have about him? I think there's more conflict to come.
Yeah, no, I don't think the political drama is at an end today. And we heard, of course, from John Major, Sir John Major, saying it was unwise to keep Boris Johnson in Downing Street. Dominic Cummings, again, taking to Twitter saying, I'm sure lots of viewers don't like these characters at all, but he was saying, you know, he will burn the place down if he's allowed to stay in there. Do you think in any way...
I think that's being a bit unkind.
Do you think there's any sense, though, that he still thinks there's a chance?
Well, he probably thinks he'll do a magnificent job over the next 10 days. He'll be seen as beating Putin in the war in Ukraine.
He might visit Kyiv again.
Who knows? He might put his name back in for the leadership contest. We hadn't considered that. Now, I mean, look, I think realistically, he'll want to go out in some way stay on a high. Yeah. He will want to try and do something. I think some of these comments from Major and others are pretty unkind. I disagree with Johnson quite strongly on the policy direction that he takes things in, but I also do acknowledge that he did get Brexit done. It's not perfect by a long shot.
And a lot of people still like him.
But we did get it over the line. A lot of people out there still do like him. But to those people, those GB News viewers and listeners who feel outraged, as many did back in 1990 when Mrs Thatcher went, there are people out there feeling outraged at what's happened, but I would just remind them, that little conversation I had with Joe Twyman from Delta Poll earlier, over half of Conservatives who voted for them in 2019 have given up. It was time. The party had to move on. And, you know, the circumstances by which a Prime Minister is removed are always difficult, always personal, always unpleasant.
OK, we're going to stick with you, Nigel. Stay there. We're going to go and speak, though, to Professor Steve Fielding. He's Professor of Political History at the University of Nottingham. Steve, good afternoon to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, your thoughts on today. We must not forget this is an historic day in British politics. I've stood on this street and seen 3 Conservative Prime Ministers resign in the space of, 6 years. It's pretty incredible.
Well, yeah, you say it's historic. It doesn't happen very often, but you've just made my point. Really, it actually happens quite frequently.
Very true.
It's not as uncommon as you might think. It's a familiar kind of sight to see a Prime Minister, maybe slightly teary-eyed, with some regret, bringing their humanity to the podium and talking to the country. So yeah, it's unprecedented. I think, however, in terms of. This is a Prime Minister who still has a majority. His party still has a majority of 75 seats. He won one of the best Conservative election victories. I mean, as he pointed out, he's probably the most successful Conservative leader since Thatcher. And here we are. I think that the drama of that decline and that demise and how to account for it, that's going to keep people writing books and thinking for ages.
And what did you make of his speech today? Some people quite critical of it. What were your thoughts?
Well, I mean, for a Boris Johnson speech, it was quite well organised. It was relatively modest, but there was one little bit in it that I thought it betrayed him and how he really saw things, and possibly a reason why he's in the mess or became in this mess and brought in this mess of Partygate and whatever. And that's when he referred to the herd instinct, to the herd turning against him. And he didn't really explain why that might be. He didn't talk about Partygate or anything like that. But he referred to, and I'm presuming it's his own colleagues, MPs, as the herd. And beyond them, there are a lot of people out there who actually have wanted Boris Johnson to resign, not just today, but months ago. And believe that he was a liar, he couldn't be trusted. And he's kind of like talking about the people as a herd. And I think that betrayed the kind of fake populism that Boris Johnson really sort of embodied. In 2019, when he talked about levelling up, getting Brexit done, he seemed to be a real populist, somebody that could go over the divide between the two parties, their natural supporters. And he did win some of those red wall seats. But I think that little comment just suggested the reason why Boris Johnson fell, and the reason why the Conservative Party is in trouble now, because it hasn't lived up to the promise that Boris Johnson outlined in 2019.
OK, and just very quickly, Steve, just before we let you go and we bring in some Nigel's views, just in terms of the future, and the Americans call their president lame duck when power starts to seep away. We call them caretaker prime ministers. What's your sense of where the party's going to go next? Do you think they're going to try and wrap this up pretty quickly?
I think so. I mean, there are so many Conservative MPs who are very unhappy with Johnson being in as a caretaker for 3 months. I'm sure they'll try to truncate the process. Maybe there might be a deal between the 2 final MPs rather than go to the members, and that's where all the time will be taken up. Then maybe they'll do a deal amongst themselves, because the longer they're associated with Boris Johnson, the more contaminated.
Fascinating stuff. Professor Steve Fielding, thank you very much indeed. The Professor of Political History there at the University of Nottingham. Fascinating, isn't it? Nigel, you know, in the end, we talk about this, there's a lot of people who still like Boris, but there are a lot of people who feel he's done quite a lot of damage to the Conservative Party and its brand.
Oh, I think that's right. And I think that's why this had to happen. I think, number one, trust, integrity, decency, truthfulness, that's big. But also on the policies, which is the thing that really upsets me. They've gone so far away. High taxes, big state, immigration running at record levels. I mean, there's a list as long as your arm of things they've done that just aren't consistent with what people expected. I heard what Steve said. There was no humility in the speech at all. Just the herd, these idiots.
The eccentric decision.
Yeah. They all turned against me. They're all fools. And he sort of trumpeted at what he saw as he saw his achievements. Do you know what? I just feel. And I've been more critical of him than almost anybody.
He's allowed a valedictory speech.
But you know what? Do you know what? Don't kick a man when he's down. He's had a pretty rough day. And
isn't that the thing? I always think about Boris Johnson. This is a man, when asked why he left journalism and got into politics, he said, well, journalists don't have statues built to them. And I remember a party conference last year, people were talking about this being the Johnson decade. This was a man that was going to win. He had the biggest majority since Thatcher in the 80s for the Conservatives. He was going to win the next election. We had to get used to Johnsonism, and yet here we are today where he's going to struggle to beat Theresa May's tenure in office. He's going to be a Callaghan, a Brown, a second-rate, let's be honest about it, a second-rate Prime Minister.
Yes, a second-rate Prime Minister, but in terms of history, and all right, I could say, look, he joined the Brexit campaign at 5 minutes to midnight, but he did join the Brexit campaign, and it was important that he did, and somebody had to cut the Gordian knot in 2019, and Johnson did that, and nobody can take that away from him. As I say, I felt for months he ought to go. I felt for months he was taking the party towards an electoral cliff edge at the next election. But on a day like today, I think let him have his moment. I'm not going to kick him whilst he's down. There will be friction next week. There'll be more calls from the majors and people like that for him not to have this 10-week period. I suspect ultimately the party probably will let him have it.
And just very finally, the election's less than 2 years away. The polls aren't that bad for the Conservative Party, but the economy's going to get a lot worse. Let's be frank about that. Do you think the Conservatives could still? I mean, it would be unprecedented, I think, for them to win what would be fifth term?
Only if it would be a fifth term. Only if they learn the lesson of Brexit, which isn't just about leaving the EU. It's about completely changing the shape of British politics. It needs radical reform and change. It needs a House of Lords that's got rid of an electoral system that has a degree of proportionality, a postal vote system that is cleaned up, bring back trust into the whole system, and maybe even a mechanism by which people can call referendums on big issues if they wanted to. If they did that and became the party of radical reforming change, they could win a fifth term.
And in the space of 30 seconds, you're on air at 7 tonight?
Yes.
I assume there's only one topic in town.
There is only one topic in town. I mean, we'd love to talk about other things, but...
Well, we can talk about how nice the weather is.